Good afternoon, guys. This is our last class before our break. I'm going to talk a little bit at the end of this lecture about what you should be expecting during your break and how to make sure you don't lose too much momentum on your projects without a deadline. I can give you guys a deadline if it would help, but I'd rather not. I want you guys to enjoy a little bit of a break, but I also don't want you to lose entirely track of what you're thinking about and what you're working on. I just wanted to give you guys a little bit too of a very quick content warning for this week. So we're going to be talking about Gamergate again. I know we talked about it like briefly, and I gave you guys a little bit of information on it. And I think I shared the documentary with you the week we were doing gaming. But this week, we're going to go into it a little bit more detail. There's a lot of information about the kinds of harassment that Zoe Quinn faced. And also, we're looking at the rise of neo-fascism on 4chan and its connection to the ascendancy of Donald Trump. I'm not going to share too many visuals from that time period. I will be sharing some visuals, nothing that is overtly like racist, but we will be talking a little bit about the kind of coding behind the racism of other kinds of visuals that neo-Nazi trolls and neo-fascist trolls on 4chan were using. I understand that this is difficult content matter. If this is a week that feels too much for you, I sent you guys emails to let you know that most of you still have quite a few of your 3 optional misses available to you. If this is one you want to take, I go ahead and take it. I totally understand. However, if this is a topic that relates to the project that you are doing, if you are looking at trolling and the ways that people are trying to build networks of affective control out of threat and danger, or if you're looking at certain kinds of political movements, right-wing, fascist political movements, anything like that in your research, this is a good week to pay attention to the readings for. Okay, with that said, let's get into it. So I wanted to give you guys a little bit of context for when these 2 pieces are emerging from. So this is the mid-2010s. You guys were all pretty young, most of you, I'm assuming, back then, so you might not have had any real exposure to what was happening. In reaction to movements that we've already discussed so far, like Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter, both online and offline, there were digital spaces like 4chan, for example, that became really overrun with trolls who were affiliated with alt-right and neo-Nazi sympathizers and neo-Nazis that were trying to use those spaces to resist leftist political movements. So Twitter and Facebook ended up often amplifying this content, even if it wasn't originating there. So it didn't just stay in the corner of 4chan or 8chan. Those spaces did lay groundwork for the ascendancy of Donald Trump. And then that kind of got slightly sanitized and then spread to Facebook and Twitter, where they really helped to push for the Tea Party and a lot of appeals to implicit and explicit sexism and racism in the wake of concerns about activist movements from the left in order to mobilize some very angry people to push for Donald Trump and a specific fascist ideology that often goes along with that. So what they did in doing this, what they did is they shifted our understanding of acceptable behavior on those spaces, right? So what had prior to that been unthinkable became pretty acceptable because everything shifted so far right, so aggressively in the direction of fascism that they made what could happen on Facebook and Twitter seem acceptable in comparison to what was happening on an 8chan. This is something that's often referred to as the Overton window. I encourage you guys to check into the Overton window as a way of understanding how political ideology frames shift back and forth and how what has been considered unacceptable in civil society as far as terms of engagement suddenly becomes more acceptable. And we're seeing primarily this happen in the last 15 years in the direction of the right. If you guys are on TikTok, if you search Overton window, there's some really great shorts there put out by a couple of different creators. Highly recommend that you encounter that. Those things that wouldn't have been able to be talked about 10 years prior were all of a sudden becoming shifted to be more okay, or at least not being shut down in mainstream social media spaces. So the first reading I gave you guys is back to Zoe Quinn's experience of being violently trolled as part of Gamergate. And this is an excerpt from her book. You'll have her introduction and first chapter from Crash Override. And she is a queer femme indie game designer known for making a game called Depression Quest, which helps people struggling with depression and other mental health issues. and she herself has struggled with those. She founded, as a result of her experiences of being targeted online, an organization called Crash Override, same name as the text that you guys are reading, which is a crisis hotline for people dealing with online harassment. Zoe Quinn starts her introduction talking about how her very bad breakup from an ex became public discourse everywhere, from, she says, SVU, right, to Wikipedia pages and Donald Trump's chief strategists talking about it. So the story she's talking about, right, is her relationship with someone named Aaron Joni. In late 2013 to 2014, they dated. That relationship was physically and emotionally abusive for her. And when she broke things off, he got angry, and his attempt to get even was to publish a 10,000-word blog post accusing her of cheating on him with 5 different guys and sleeping with a journalist at the gaming site Kotaku in exchange for a good review for her work. So this ends up feeding into a lot of really sexist narratives that women in gaming are there primarily because they're sexually attractive, or that they have manipulated sex appeal in order to gain visibility. And this obviously is not something that only exists in gaming spaces. This is a narrative that has followed women in the workplace forever, right? That quote unquote women sweep themselves to the top, right? Sweep their way to the top. So that's a lot of what started to happen here. And what the difference is, of course, is that, different from office nonsense, right? This exists in not only about a relationship with somebody whose life exists largely online through their work, but also it exists in the time of social media. And so a lot of people, as you guys have seen in other spaces, put their kind of parasocial investments in their ideas about people and their relationships forward into the way that they're engaging. I know some of you are looking at how people are talking about different relationships of celebrities right now, and what happens in the comment sections and the emotional investments that people put into their conversations about people they don't know and the relationships that are happening there. And so this is another instance of how that happened, but with particularly nasty effects, with a lot of real world implications for Zoe Quinn. So the blog post started to circulate widely, mostly on 4chan and 8chan, which we'll read more about in our second reading, and the gaming world online, as Quinn describes it. And she says that it was like counting the seconds between thunderclaps, right? You remember that in the reading, to see how far away a storm is, knowing it's getting closer and navigating that impending doom. So it's about this kind of very anxiety-laden space of waiting for the next assault. And some of those were threats of real physical assaults, as you'll see in the text. Again, content warning on that. Some of them are really upsetting. In addition to some of the really violent things that they say to her, she also writes that the places where she sold her games, talked with her friends, and looked at cute cat videos, right? All the ways we use media were suddenly awash with pictures of mutilated bodies, images of horrible violence, and threats to do the same to her or worse. And she notes that her home address and phone number were discovered and distributed, and that she was getting like 5 a.m. phone calls from strangers detailing the ways that they planned to sexually assault her and bragging about leaving dead animals in her mailbox. So doxing, as many of you will already be familiar with, is the exposure of an online personality, or just anyone who exists online, the online exposure of somebody's IRL information. So their full name, where they live, like those kinds of, their phone number, right, with the intention that people gathering that information will use that information to harm and harass someone. So the conflict snowballed into an international one, with people from all over the world, trolls all over the world, weighing in on this from 2014 to 2015. Quinn came to represent everything that they had built up in their minds as the enemy, as like a feminist, queer, her being also more successful in the gaming world than like many of the men who were attacking her could possibly ever imagine themselves to be, right? So there's a lot of things built into this. This is also the rise of the same time period. We're talking about the rise of incels, or men who are angry at the existence of feminism and blame it for the fact that they are unpartnered and struggle to negotiate relationships with women. Soon others would be drawn into the fray as well. And Anita Sarkeesian, Feminist Frequency, and Brianna Wu, Giant Space Cat, they also became targets. So the alt-right started to come out of the woodwork and come to the defense of Zoe Quinn's ex and all of the Gamergate trolls that were facing criticism in the public, including Mike Chernevich, a fascist celebrity lawyer who offered to represent her ex, and Milo Yiannopoulos, who was an alt-right media personality and writer. He was an openly gay man who was using his position as a gay man to argue that Trump and the alt-right were not, in fact, actually sexist or homophobic or racist, when in fact he himself was extremely homophobic, sexist, and racist, despite being a gay man himself. And they both used this, as did other alt celebrities, use this case as a kind of touchstone for themselves to expand their base and to also lead into more public support for their fictionalized version of an idea of free speech around Gamergate, and all of this, of course, leading up to the Trump presidential campaign, which they were all on the coattails of to benefit from. So in another part of the book that I didn't give you guys, Quinn she gives some reflections on her experience and why it was so difficult to stop Gamergate. And she kept trying to reach out to the police in order to try to file complaints, and they weren't taken seriously. And she writes later on in the book, the candid advice that so many people give abuse victims is simply to inform the police. But there are many layers of this particularly shitty onion to peel back that illustrate how much of a non-solution that really is. Setting aside the myriad social, financial, and personal reasons that somebody might be unwilling or unable to work with law enforcement when they've been the victim of a crime, the actual act of doing so is riddled with problems at every level, especially when it comes to online abuse. One of the things that becomes very clear through the whole process of Gamergate is the fact that whatever your feelings about law enforcement structures are, there is nothing in the existing structures as they currently are that allows for negotiating online situations clearly, right? We don't have laws around a lot of this stuff. So what counts as harassment is still very much framed legalistically in terms of what happens in physical spaces for the most part, right? There are some small versions, right? But things like taking somebody's likeness and putting it in images of sexual assault or violence or things like that, and publishing those things and as like a form of threat is unclear, right? We don't even have legal language firmly in place, and we definitely didn't at the time. We have more now, but we definitely didn't at the time of this event for people to even be able to navigate it, aside from the fact that like the police have historically not been very supportive of female, especially, but every victim of sexual or gender-based harassment, right? So these are just things to be thinking about. And so Zoe moves on to develop this crisis hotline and advocacy group named the same as this text you're reading in order to provide a resource center for people experiencing online abuse. And she started that with her partner at the time, Alex Lifshitz, who was very supportive of her, and they together worked to develop tools to fight these kinds of attacks online and provide support for people who are facing them. And you can learn more about that if any of you want to continue to read her book. I think a lot of it is available for free online if you're curious. Also, some of this is covered there's a couple of YouTube videos I didn't link for you, but they're easy to find if you want to, talking about Crash Override, the organization. For your second reading, I gave you guys Mike Wendling's section from his book, Alt-Right from 4chan to the White House, and you have chapter 3. Mike Wendling is a BBC journalist and podcaster. So neither of your readings this week are academic texts. It doesn't mean that you can't use them, but we'll need to talk about what we're doing for theoretical frameworks if you want to use some of the ideas in these texts for your analysis of your own sites. So he's a journalist and a podcaster, and he does a lot of research on the alt-right, and he wrote this book, Alt-Right from 4chan to the White House. So Wendling tracks the trajectory of 4chan from a relatively open platform where free speech was celebrated to one that was full of hate speech. In short, he argues that the trolls won and became integrated into the larger alt-right media sphere. So again, that relates to what we're talking about when I was suggesting you guys look into the Overton window. This is an example of that. He doesn't use that term, but this is what we're looking at. And that this was already in the works, he says, but solidified specifically during the Trump campaign. And people may or may not know Pepe the Frog was a big symbol for alt-right 4chaners at the time. So that's Pepe the Frog there. You'll see him repeatedly through the next few slides because he became a dog whistle for 4chan trolls, but also specifically for neo-fascists to be able to have a symbol that on the face of it looked pretty innocuous and unrelated to anything identifiably fascist, but became like a symbol for them to be able to catch one another. So hence dog whistle. So one of the things he singled out is a particular channel on 4chan, /Paul /. This 4chan Paul is where the alt-right would go to test out their memes with each other and communicate with in-jokes, plot raids against the quote-unquote normies, which is anybody who isn't indoctrinated into their neo-fascist model of doing things, right? And again, you'll see here, again, there's Pepe the Frog, but here reconstructed as an octopus taking over the world. On the left there, you'll also see another very common 4chan neo-fascist meme, which is the cryy face, and also the other one below it, which is the mask over the cryy face covered with MAGA hats or whatever, right? So these are symbols that they would use typically for mocking leftists, the crying face, right? But there's a lot of these kinds of memes that still circulate. They've largely become troublingly like disarticulated or separated from the ideological uses they originally had while they still continue to linger around. I'm sure many of you have seen these, but they still carry that history with them, right? And a lot of this stuff often gets really blown up. And there was a channel that was called _Donald, which was small but extremely influential. And Wendling writes from the Donald, the alt-right radiates into Twitter and other social networks to Trump's own Twitter account, where he starts to reproduce some of these narratives and memes that were actually constructing him from 4chan and 8chan and building his brand. So there's a layered media ecosystem to the alt-right where they would test things out and in these channels on 4chan and 8chan, and that then was get workshopped, really, right? And things that they thought worked effectively would then be pushed out into other platforms for a more general public. And I want us to think about this, and we talked about it last week too, when we were thinking about how QAnon was not really an aberration from participatory culture, right? That the kind of like affective register or the paranoid fascist tendencies of a particular group through social media. It's not like it's determined by the media, right? We're trying to navigate this conversation. We had those people very early on in our readings that were hopeful that participatory culture was necessarily more democratic, right? Was more progressive. And I think what we see repeatedly is that a lot of things happen in those spaces that are neither progressive nor democratic, right? And that are instead like tied to fascist political ideologies and aesthetics and like what happens there. And what we're finding is that too, I think it's important for us to also note there's a tendency to then have a kind of to go from a hopeful technological determinism to a really negative nihilistic technological determinism that says, okay, now shoot, right? We were wrong. It's not hopeful. It's actually like a hellscape. And clearly it's a hellscape because of the structure itself. And I want us to just think about this, right? And to think about the fact that happens, for those of you who've taken intro to media, this happens in every media format, right? There's always a kind of like new hopefulness as something comes up that has more has more accessibility for a wider populace that will hopefully lead to more progressive politics. And then something happens in it that's terrible, right? And then there's suddenly a panic that, oh my God, maybe it's the books that are causing the problem. Maybe it's the radio that's causing the problem. Maybe it's the video games that are causing the problem. Maybe it's social media that is the problem. And I want us to just always live in a pretty complicated relationship to those ideas about social media that are technologically determinist, right? To push back against that and say that actually these things happen in multiple kinds of spaces. There are things about the affordances of social media and participatory cultures more broadly that allow them to happen faster and to be amplified. And that is absolutely true. And there are also certain risks to these spaces because of people who typically would not find means of connection without social media suddenly having a lot of access to that connection, right? These are things to be wary of and aware of for sure. But to have a sudden kind of assertion that the technology itself is the problem, I just want us to always live in a sort of complicated space around that thinking. In the same way that it is neither utopian, it is neither fully dystopian either. And we'll get to the end of that when I talk to you guys about the elves that I added to your reading this week. But first, let's talk a little bit more about the shittiness that happened in this space, right? what happens is that they used a lot of memes on 4chan and 8chan, and there was a coded visual language that came from that kind of in-group meme knowledge. Not so different from bakers, right? People who, in the QAnon story, right? People who know the inside of a thing or helped to produce the meme. And we're going to talk more about memes not next week, but our next class. And that memeing was like a way to signal certain kinds of group in knowledge. So Pepe the Frog, he was originally a kind of a harmless counterculture figure created by somebody named Matt Furry, who was himself not a fascist or an alt-right sympathizer. But it did get adopted by that group, right? And so it starts to circulate and become transformed and attached to certain kinds of things. So he would become like a character that they would put like Hitler mustaches on him and things like that. And people would use Pepe to stand in for fascist sympathies and other problematic things. And so Cassandra Fairbanks was working for Sputnik, which as hopefully is a Russian propaganda outlet in DC. And also a prominent Twitter celebrity at the time. And she went all in on the Trump campaign. And that's her here in the middle. And with Mike Chernovich, who we saw in a previous slide, doing the OK symbol. The OK symbol is one of these kinds of symbols, right? Where basically this is a way to indicate that you're part of an in-group, that they know what they're signifying to other people. And that in-group, in this case, is white people. This is a white supremacist symbol, right? And I think, again, this is like the Pepe and the Frog thing. It did not start. Obviously, the OK symbol predates its use in white supremacist fascism that came out of 4chan and came out of these kinds of communities, right? A thing which has like a kind of innocuous public presence gets taken up and retooled for a certain use. Yeah. And so became a white supremacist identitarian symbol. And also you'll see the flag of Kyrgyzstan and was a fictional country founded on the 4chan boards. And I think it's pretty obvious what's happening there. Visually, that's also a white ethno state with indications and hints to things like the KKK, right? And also something not so different from like a swastika model, right? It isn't a swastika. Nothing about it is actually reproducing the swastika. And there are 4Ks instead of 3. But, right, obviously they're taking the aesthetics of these different kinds of fascist images and putting them together in a way that's fictitious but produces a kind of symbol altogether. And so it wasn't subtle, and they're trying to communicate that this, but also keep it beyond plausible deniability, right? So that they can stay legally protected of not using known hate symbols, but still, right, arguing for a white ethno state. Yeah. While still getting to claim, we're not really fascist. But obviously, it is. And Wendling argues that there's a kind of shift from implicit to explicit racism on the Chans. And he says that there's these spaces primed people to accept alt-right and fascist ideas because they were disguised originally as irony. And they were not things that people would recognize as racist and fascist in the very beginning. They just were like symbols that made people feel like they were part of an in crowd. And then those things became more explicitly racist and fascist. And that ironic detachment and plausible deniability eventually falls down and reveals explicitly racist slurs, takedowns of feminists, violent threats to queer people, and endorsements of literal neo-Nazis. And so it stops being a joke and starts being like very real. And again, this ties into some extent, I think, with some of the things that we were looking at with QAnon, right? There's a way that people are practicing in what seems to be almost a kind of jokey play space of this online process that then starts to have very real world implications. And again, I did not reproduce the images here, and I'm not going to, but there were a lot of visuals that started to come up on 4chans and 8chans that were known, very recognizable racist images about Jewish people of color, Muslim people, and obviously women. They're just things that kind of were well beyond the pale of plausible deniability. But that didn't happen until that kind of Overton window shift started to happen in these spaces, and people built up a sense of familiarity and connection to the people they were working with, going back to last week's reading. And so at a certain point, this also becomes not just speech and has real impacts on people's lives, similar to what we see right in the Gamergate situation. And it's something to think about like how we want to think about responsibly monitoring platforms, right? Because I think the question is obviously we don't want to live in a world where there's no free speech. And we definitely don't necessarily want to build up structures of more policing in order to control spaces of engagement, because that just builds another kind of fascism, right? But at the same time, what do we do? How do we think about making sure that these spaces do not become that participatory culture modality doesn't get turned towards these kinds of projects, right? And hopefully these are things that you're having these kinds of conversations in other spaces too, and other kinds of communication and media classes. If you're in that, if you're in this department more in depth, it's a difficult question. And I think a lot of us are trying to navigate this in the work that we're doing. And as a society, we're all really trying to reconsider what the role of social media is, what kind of speech we want there, and how we want to set limits on it and understand how to to enact those limits. And so on both a hopeful and also slightly sad, because this predates the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was what they were trying to fight in many ways, right? The ideological basis for that invasion. I wanted to share with you guys, there's a video and there's also a short Time magazine article about Baltic elves. So people from Latvia and a few other countries that were attempting to discredit and work against Russian trolls who were pushing for violence and the attack on Ukraine. And you'll see in the way that they talk about their work, I thought what might be interesting for us, especially considering last week's conversation on conspiracy and this week on trolls, the specific kind of commitment to trying to spread truth, right? They talk about this. They say that you can't fight lies with more lies. And they say propaganda is lies. I wanted to push back a little bit on this, right? Because I think it's important for us to remember that PR and propaganda is not necessarily a lie, right? What it is, a certain kind of communication set up with a particular goal in mind. It can be absolutely truthful. What it does have, though, is an ideological spin to it, right? There is an intention behind it. One could argue that their ideological spin, their propaganda, is the value of truth telling, right? Of factual positioning, which comes up in some of the things we were thinking about last week, too, right? What is truth? Who gets to decide that? But I thought that they were a particularly moving group of trying really hard as a group of concerned citizens to push back against the kind of juggernaut of trolling and the state that it's gotten to, especially with the advent of AI. And so we have, bots that do this sort of work. And so that's where I'm leaving it for this week for you guys. And I know this is a little bit bleak. I really do look forward to hearing what you guys have to say about this in your discussion post for the week, how you're thinking about what's happening in trolls and trolling now, experiences that you have had growing up, because I recognize that for a lot of you, this climate that I'm talking about of 2010s was probably like part of what was happening on the internet when you were kids. And I don't know how much of it you saw, and I don't know how much of it you had participated in, but how much of it was around you in ways that were tangible to you, or visible to you. And I wonder the kind of way that impacts you now and how you think about these things. So if you guys wouldn't mind thinking about that in your discussion posts this week and sharing whatever you're comfortable sharing, including, as usual, any visuals, anything happening in media you want to talk about. Again, let's remember we want to stay cautious of one another in the space too. This is a really painful time for a lot of people. There's a lot of conflict going on around the world, and a lot of people are feeling pretty raw. Please do share things, but please think about what you're sharing and the possible impact it may have. Yeah. And I hope you guys have a really good break. So what I'm saying about your research projects, you do not have a journal entry due next week. You do have one due right before Thanksgiving break. And then you won't have one due the week after. You'll have that week. So you can think of it as you don't have class again for almost like 2 weeks. So you get a little breathing room. Don't abandon your site because you'll lose track of what's going on there. Try to pay a little bit of attention. You can still take journal notes for yourself. If any of you are missing journal entries, this is a good time to make up a week that you didn't catch and send it to me via email or whatever. Please, just have a good couple of weeks. Try to get some rest while also keeping some of these thoughts in mind. I hope you guys get to spend good times with your family and take the time away from classes that hopefully you have. All right. Very best to you guys. Take care. Talk to you soon.